Winthrop's spiritual memoir was like hundreds of others written by fellow Puritans and follows a familiar formula. According to Schweninger, this formula sequence is the one outlined by James. Despair, followed by joyful illumination and dedication to a mission from God. In fact, such a mood-swing-based conversion narrative was actually required to become a member of the churches of Massachusetts, and being a church member was a requirement to vote in civil elections. Does the appreciation of this cultural context imply that Winthrop's mood swings were within normal limits? No. It suggests that the Puritan population was made up of people with bipolar temperaments, self-selected converts to an extreme religious movement are hardly a random sample of humanity. Winthrop was one fanatic among many, and in fact was hardly the most extreme of his fellow extremists. His comparatively sober judgment was often needed to keep his fellow saints in balance. John Winthrop organized the Great Migration in 1629, when he became convinced that England's sins had provoked God beyond his breaking point. He wrote to his wife, "I am verily persuaded that God will bring some more heavy affliction upon this land, and that speedily." Winthrop was not alone in these beliefs. The clergy who would constitute the religious oligarchy of Massachusetts became convinced that the end was near for Britain. John Cotton counseled that a wise man who foreseeth a plague should hide himself from it. Thomas Hooker told his congregation before he departed to New England, "God told me yesterday night that he should destroy England and lay it waste. New England shall be his refuge for his Noahs and his Lots." Thomas Shepard wrote in his autobiography that God was about to bring heavy plagues upon England for its national sins that would include sore afflictions of famine, war, blood, mortality, and deaths. You have to be at least a little manic to be certain you know that the apocalypse is now. The Arabella would sail less than a year after Winthrop had his revelatory insight. The rapidity with which he organized the expedition that founded New England can be attributed to his hypomanic pace and the intensity of his millennial urgency. In his recruitment letter, Winthrop warned his fellow Puritans to emigrate to safety. God hath provided this place to be a refuge for many. He means to save out of the general calamity. The church has no place left to fly but into the wilderness. Even among the religious extremists, derisively called Puritans by their more conventional opponents, the settlers of New England represented a lunatic fringe whose paranoia was matched only by their grandiosity. They were not just fleeing Egypt one step ahead of the plagues. They were founding the New Jerusalem. They had been selected by God to be his new chosen people, his new Israel, sent on an errand in the wilderness. The Great Migration was motivated by messianism. At the same time, the Great Migration reflected an entrepreneurial spirit. The zealous pursuit of God was reinforced by an equal zeal for mammon, most particularly in the form of land. The search for land in America stood behind many migration decisions, even of the most religious emigrants, wrote Alan Kulikoff, and from British presidents to colonial American farmers. In his recruitment letter, Winthrop stressed the availability of land. Why then should we stand striving for a place of habitation and in the meantime suffer a whole continent as fruitful and convenient for the use of man to lie waste without improvement? The whole earth is the Lord's garden, and he has given it to the sons of men with a commission: increase and multiply. That England was in the beginning of an economic depression made Winthrop's call to develop this real estate, which he framed as a religious duty, and all the more compelling. The settlers were venture capitalists of a sort, but instead of risking their money, they were risking their lives. Human capital was the only thing of value many had to risk or borrow against. Those who couldn't afford the ship's passage ran themselves into indentured servitude, a time-limited contract under which, after a similar number of years working the land, they could pay off their debt and eventually become landowners themselves. 2/3 of the indentured servants did eventually become landowners. Land was the principal capital of 17th century America, and these early American startup farmers were entrepreneurs. And there were Puritan investors looking for an economic return in exchange for funding the city of God. Puritan merchants who remained in England pooled their capital in a relatively new thing called a joint stock company. Companies such as Winthrop's Massachusetts Bay Company, the Plymouth Company, and the Virginia Company launched the ships that took settlers to America, and their stockholders received huge swaths of prime real estate for their investment and nation building. Religious zeal and entrepreneurial zeal may have different objects, but they require the same type of personality. It takes a special kind of person to obsessively pursue a vision, which is what zealots do. German sociologist Max Weber thought the seeds of modern capitalism could be found among 17th century Protestant groups such as the Puritans and Quakers. The kind of fanatics who were attracted to such extreme sects were, much like Luther himself, a distinct species of men, Weber wrote in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism in 1904. In the medieval Catholic Church, only the priests had a special relationship with God, but in Luther's priesthood of all believers, every man had a calling, a task set by God, which transformed his secular labor into a holy quest. When this fanatical species of men apply themselves to commerce with their missionary intensity, new levels of industry and efficiency were achieved, and as a result, these men accumulated capital. Because these religious sects were ascetic as well as zealous, they frowned upon the conspicuous consumption of their own wealth. Instead, they reinvested it in their businesses, creating commercial empires. An errand in the wilderness. The first sighting of land was exhilarating to those aboard the Arabella. After 2 months of freezing rain, starvation, and every manner of privation, Winthrop's followers could see the coast. There came a smell off the shore like the smell of a garden, wrote Winthrop in his diary. Just as Moses addressed the Jews before they crossed the Jordan River to take possession of the Promised Land, Winthrop spoke to the assembled faithful on the deck of the Arabella, delivering what has been called the most influential sermon in American history. Winthrop claimed that God had made a covenant with them, his new chosen people, and it contained the same warnings and promises Moses spoke of. If they were unfaithful to God, Winthrop warned the American experiment would become a shipwreck. But if they were faithful, God would dwell among us as his people and command a blessing upon us in all our ways. National security. 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, and material wealth will automatically ensue. Winthrop defined America as a city on a hill. America could become a beacon calling all the peoples of the world to God. All eyes will be upon you, he prophesied. They were on a mission of cosmic significance, nothing less than the redemption of the world, wrote Lauren Baritz in City on a Hill. When the Puritans aboard the Arabella reached the shore, they felt they had been saved. They shouldn't have. They were about to descend into the ice of a New England winter unlike anything they have ever experienced before. 1,000 Puritans sailed with Winthrop. 200 died that first winter, and almost that many took the first boat home. Yet Winthrop's spirits were buoyant during the time of tribulation. He sailed in an exuberant mood and never lost him. He was relentlessly optimistic and wrote home that he had never felt better, despite the fact that the first casualty was his own son Henry, who drowned the day they arrived. They were building their theocracy, and he was excited. In the end, the numbers would justify his optimism. A few hundred souls were lost that first winter, but 20,000 English colonists came to Boston Harbor over the next 10 years. Winthrop would build his city of God, and it would thrive just as he had predicted. The image of the city on the hill has become an eternal American archetype, emblazoned on our collective national conscience. In his final address before leaving the presidency, Ronald Reagan spoke of the city on the hill as the central guiding image of his life. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, a tall, proud city built on rock stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, a city of free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And she's still a beacon, still a magnet for all who must have freedom, for all the pilgrims from all the lost places who are hurtling through the darkness towards home. The idea that America was chosen by God for a special role in his divine plan was as real for Reagan as it was for Winthrop, and it continues to be real for American leaders such as President George W. Bush, who has spoken openly about his feeling that God has called the United States to be the instrument of his divine will and is waging war in pursuit of that aim. Our indignant European allies would surely agree with Edmund Morgan, who wrote that our Puritan heritage has imbued us with a sense of mission, a divine favor, that has added an ingredient of self-righteousness to every enterprise Americans undertook as a people. By any measure, Americans are still the most religiously fervent people in the developed world. 90% of Americans believe in God, and 58% say their faith is important to them, as compared to 12% of the French and 19% of the British. Many Americans still have conversion experiences like those described by James. 1 out of 5 Americans, including George W. Bush, claim to have experienced a religious conversion. This virgin continent was seeded by Protestant prophets, and you could say that since that moment of inception, America has been, and perhaps always will be, a messianic nation. At the very least, the land is overrun with messiahs, as 19th century observer Charles Ferguson noted. America will never suffer a shortage of people with plans to change the world. Roger Williams, Troubler of Israel. Amid the suffering of that first winter, a ship from England arrived one cold February morning with much-needed supplies. John Winthrop recorded in his journal that it also brought a godly minister, Roger Williams. Winthrop instantly liked Williams, who radiated an unmistakable aura of holiness. He was a palpable saint in a society that set a high value on sainthood, wrote Edmund Morgan. The magistrates of Boston quickly offered Williams their most exalted ecclesiastical position, the pastorate of the Boston Church. As if by providential design, the man in the Boston pulpit at that time was going back to England on the very same ship. Williams appeared to be a godsend. Soon after he touched land, the cold weather broke. But Williams, the Puritan's Puritan, didn't find Winthrop's City of God to be pure enough. The first hint of trouble, according to Winthrop's diaries, occurred when Williams insisted that the congregation in Boston make a public declaration of their repentance for having communion with the churches of England while they lived there. When they refused, he refused the pastorate. I durst not officiate to an unseparated people, Williams proclaimed. Moreover, he felt morally obliged to separate from the unseparated people of Boston. He could follow a belief to its conclusion with a passionate literalness that bordered on the ridiculousness. on the ridiculous, according to Morgan, and he only became more radical and strident over time. The anti-establishment eccentric was a man of wild and volatile opinions. Paul Johnson wrote in A History of the American People, "The problem was that Williams was divinely mad," according to Richard Hubbard, who wrote A History of New England in 1680. Williams' racing thoughts, a clear sign of hypomania, flew from one idea to another. John Cotton, the most popular preacher in Massachusetts, compared Williams' mind to a windmill whirling so fast that it set itself on fire. Even otherwise appreciative modern scholars became exasperated when commenting on the windmill-like writing style. Though brilliant, his work is described as hurriedly written, endlessly verbose, and chaotically punctuated. Williams moved on to the church in Salem, where he was offered a teaching position despite the controversy in Boston. Winthrop intervened, however, pressuring the Salemites to rescind their offer. As a result, Williams left Salem in 1631 for Plymouth. The explicitly separatist community founded by the Pilgrims, as in Boston and Salem, the people there were initially impressed with Williams' fervor. Plymouth's founding governor, William Bradford, marred the truth of even his sharpest admonitions and reproofs. But gradually, Bradford began to recognize that Williams was a man godly and zealous, having many precious parts, but very unsettled in judgment. In 1633, he noticed that Williams began to fall into strange opinions and from opinion to practice, which caused some controversy between the church and him. The combination of extreme zeal, odd ideas, and poor judgment in the classic presentation of the hypomanic, such individuals stir up controversy in any organization as they aggressively seek converts to their idiosyncratic way of thinking. They try, often in dramatic fashion, to take charge of the group and change its mission. Williams would leave Plymouth disillusioned. Even the separates of Plymouth were not, in his view, true separatists. He was shocked to discover that a few weak souls attended Church of England services when visiting their relatives back home. When the Plymouth church did nothing to discipline these backsliders, Williams felt compelled to separate from them too. He tried to impose his own singular opinions about rigid separation on the congregation and chose to leave when he failed to get their support, according to a book published in 1699 by Plymouth congregant Nathaniel Morton. William went back to Salem, where they took him in as a teacher, unofficially, to avoid conflict with Boston. There he built a following among a group in the throes of a separatist revival. This adulation probably only fanned the firebrand's hypomania. In a state of heightened grandiosity, he felt ready to take on the king. He sent an outrageous letter to Winthrop and Bradford, addressed to King Charles. The patent the king had granted the Massachusetts Bay Colony was based on a solemn public lie, Williams proclaimed. The land had never been the king's to grant in the first place. It belonged to the Indians. He also charged the king with blasphemy for referring to Europe as a Christendom, and he did personally apply to our present king 3 very unflattering passages from Revelations, wrote Winthrop. The Massachusetts magistrates immediately summoned Williams to court in December 1633. Winthrop persuaded Williams to promise not to publicly repeat his allegations against the king, and the matter was deemed resolved. But Williams was soon found preaching against the king's patent again. Only now he was proclaiming that it should be returned to the king. He drafted a letter to Charles I, asking the king to acknowledge the evil of the patent, along with a request that he rewrite it without his former lies. When the court met again in March 1635, it was ready to deal with this madman, according to Morgan. But John Cotton, who ironically would later become William's greatest enemy, intervened on William's behalf and resolved the matter by convincing Williams to drop his recklessly provocative letter. In typical Hypomanic fashion, Williams seemed oblivious of the potentially dire consequences his letter would produce both for himself and the colony. The Massachusetts Bay Company held their charter at the king's pleasure, and it could be easily revoked. In 1635, America was hardly strong enough to declare independence from Britain. Rather than calming down, William seemed to escalate his pace of descent. His separatism now began to spin faster, wrote Morgan. The standard hypomanic response to opposition is to speed up, escalate, crank up the volume. Only a few months later, Williams was again called before the court for preaching against a law that required all male inhabitants over the age of 16 to swear an oath of allegiance to the state. If the oath were administered to a wicked man, Williams claimed it would cause him to take the name of God in vain. In addition, he now preached that regenerate men should not pray in the presence of the unregenerate, even their own wives and children. When the pastor of Salem died, the congregation openly defied the Massachusetts magistrates and appointed Williams. The magistrates warned Salem that Williams' erroneous and dangerous opinions would lead their church into heresy, apostasy, or tyranny. The magistrates then held up Salem's request for a land grant in Marblehead Neck, explicitly holding a hostage unless they agreed to dump Williams. Decrying the manipulative tactic as a violation of the sacred Puritan principle of congressional independence, Williams mounted a public attack on the magistrates, condemning their heinous sin in a letter circulated to all Massachusetts churches.